The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Tennessee State Courthouse, casting long shadows across Judge William Harrington's desk. At 62 years old, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he had spent the last 15 years believing he had seen everything there was to see in his courtroom. This Wednesday morning in September started just like any other, with a stack of traffic violations and minor offenses waiting for his attention. Judge Harrington adjusted his black robe and checked his watch, 9:15 a.m. The familiar sound of his gavel echoed through courtroom 3B. "Next case," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from years on the bench. The bailiff, Officer Thompson, stepped forward with the next file. "Case number 2023 TC 458, traffic violation," Officer Thompson announced, his deep voice carrying across the wooden benches where a handful of people waited their turn. The large wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and Dr. Alexandria Pierce walked in. She was 45 years old, dressed in a navy blue business suit that spoke of quiet professionalism. Her natural hair was styled neatly, and she carried a small leather briefcase that contained her documents. Several heads turned as she made her way down the center aisle, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Judge Harrington barely looked up from his papers. "Step forward," he said, his tone already carrying a note of impatience. It was the same tone he used for all traffic violations, bored, slightly irritated, and eager to move on to more important matters. Dr. Pierce approached the podium with confidence, standing straight as she placed her driver's license and registration on the surface before her. "Good morning, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and professional. The judge glanced at the citation in front of him. "Says here you were caught doing 45 in a 40 zone on Madison Avenue." He looked at her over his glasses. "Do you know how many accidents happen because people can't follow simple speed limits?" "Yes, Your Honor," Dr. Pierce responded calmly. "I understand the importance of traffic safety. If I may explain, I was on my way to deliver a keynote speech at the State Bar Association's annual conference. There was an unexpected detour due to road construction, and I was trying to make up for lost time. It was a momentary lapse in judgment, and I take full responsibility." Judge Harrington's expression hardened. In his mind, he was already categorizing this as another case of someone trying to talk their way out of a ticket. He had heard every excuse in the book: running late, emergency situations, didn't see the sign. To him, they all sounded the same. "Ms. Pierce," he began, deliberately using Ms., despite the doctor clearly written on her citation. "That's Dr. Pierce, Your Honor." She corrected him politely but firmly. The judge's face reddened slightly at the correction. The courtroom, which had been filled with the usual shuffling and quiet whispers, grew noticeably quieter. Even Officer Thompson, who had seen thousands of cases, shifted uncomfortably at his post. "Dr. Pierce," Judge Harrington continued, his voice taking on an edge, "your credentials don't exempt you from following traffic laws. Your reason for speeding doesn't change the fact that you broke the law. The speed limit isn't a suggestion." Dr. Pierce maintained her composure, though anyone watching closely might have noticed her fingers tighten slightly on the podium. "I understand completely, Your Honor. As I mentioned, I accept responsibility for my actions." Judge Harrington shuffled through some papers on his desk, though he had already made up his mind. "Given the seriousness of traffic violations in our city, and to ensure this serves as a proper deterrent, I'm imposing a fine of $350. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Everyone present knew that first-time speeding tickets, especially for just 5 miles per hour over the limit, usually resulted in a warning or, at most, a minimal fine. Dr. Pierce looked at the judge for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she reached into her briefcase and removed her checkbook. The sound of her pen scratching against paper seemed unusually loud in the tense courtroom. "Will that be all, Your Honor?" she asked, her voice steady and dignified. Judge Harrington waved his hand dismissively. "You're free to go. Next case," he called out, already looking down at his next file. As Dr. Pierce turned to leave, she held her head high, walking with the same confidence she had entered with. Several people in the courtroom watched her go, and a few shook their heads in quiet disapproval, not at her, but at what they had just witnessed. Little did Judge William Harrington know that this brief interaction would soon become national news, and his comfortable world was about to be turned upside down. By lunchtime, Judge William Harrington had forgotten about the morning's encounter with Dr. Alexandria Pierce. He sat in his private chambers, unwrapping the turkey sandwich his wife had packed for him, when his clerk, Jenny Martinez, knocked on his door. "Come in," he called out, brushing crumbs from his black robe. Jenny entered with a concerned look on her face. "Judge Harrington, there's something you should know about the woman you find this morning, Dr. Pierce. Several lawyers in the building are talking about it." The judge took another bite of his sandwich. "The speeding ticket. What's there to talk about?" He reached for his coffee, barely paying attention. "Well, sir," Jenny continued, shifting uncomfortably, "I've looked up her record. Dr. Pierce has no prior violations, not even a parking ticket. And according to court records, you haven't given anyone the maximum fine for a first-time speeding offense in the past 3 years." Judge Harrington's hand froze halfway to his mouth. "Are you suggesting something, Ms. Martinez?" Before Jenny could respond, there was another knock. Officer Thompson, the bailiff from the morning session, stepped in. "Judge, there's a small crowd of reporters gathering outside the courthouse. They're asking about this morning's traffic court session." The judge put down his sandwich, his appetite suddenly gone. "Reporters? For a traffic violation?" His voice rose with disbelief. Officer Thompson nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. And there's more. The courthouse security footage from this morning has already been requested by 3 different news stations." Judge Harrington's face paled slightly. He reached for his computer mouse, opening his web browser. A quick search of Dr. Alexandria Pierce's name made his stomach drop. There she was. Dozens of recent news articles about her. Dr. Alexandria Pierce, Harvard Law graduate, former state Supreme Court clerk, civil rights attorney, and now a rising political figure. The most recent articles highlighted her impressive track record of fighting against judicial bias and her work in communities across the country. "Sir," Jenny said gently, "the standard fine for a first offense of 5 miles per hour over the speed limit is usually $75, or often just a warning. You fined her $350. The judge loosened his collar, feeling suddenly warm. "I treat everyone the same way in my courtroom," he insisted, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Jenny placed a folder on his desk. "I pulled the records from the past month, Judge. There were 17 similar speeding cases. 14 received warnings, 2 paid $75 fines, and 1 paid $100 because it was a school zone." Outside the chamber windows, they could hear the growing buzz of voices. The number of reporters had doubled in just the past few minutes. Judge Harrington stood up and walked to the window, pulling the blinds aside slightly. He saw camera crews setting up their equipment on the courthouse steps. A crowd was gathering, and some people held signs, though he couldn't read them from this distance. His phone buzzed. A message from the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. "Bill, we need to talk about this morning's traffic court session. My office, 2 p.m. The judge sat heavily in his leather chair, the reality of the situation sinking in. He thought about Dr. Pierce's dignified behavior in his courtroom, how she had maintained her composure even as he deliberately dismissed her title, even as he handed down an obviously excessive fine. Officer Thompson cleared his throat. "Judge, there's one more thing. The security camera caught everything, your expression when she corrected you about her title, the way you shuffled papers to look busy, even your dismissive wave when she left. The footage is, well, it doesn't look good." Jenny stepped forward, placing a printout on his desk. It was a screenshot from a legal blog, already discussing the morning's events. The headline read, "Tennessee Judge's Excessive Fine Raises Questions About Judicial Bias." Judge Harrington picked up the paper with trembling hands. In all his years on the bench, he had prided himself on being fair and just. But now, seeing his actions laid bare in black and white, he couldn't ignore the uncomfortable truth staring back at him. "What should we do, sir?" Jenny asked quietly. Before the judge could answer, his phone buzzed again. This time it was his wife. "Bill, you need to turn on the news. Right now." Outside, the crowd continued to grow, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the blinds, much like the shadow now falling over Judge Harrington's carefully constructed world. In just a few hours, his routine traffic court session had turned into something that threatened to unravel everything he had built over his 15-year career on the bench. The evening air hummed with excitement at the grand ballroom of the Memphis Convention Center. Dr. Alexandria Pierce stood backstage, reviewing her speech notes one final time. The events from traffic court that morning seemed distant now, though her check for $350 was still fresh in her mind. Sarah Chen, her campaign manager, rushed over with a tablet in hand. "Dr. Pierce, have you seen the news? The courthouse video is everywhere." Sarah's face showed both concern and a hint of unexpected opportunity. "Your phone has been ringing nonstop. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, they all want interviews." Dr. Pierce smoothed her royal blue blazer, a small smile playing at her lips. "Let's focus on tonight, Sarah. We have 2,000 people waiting out there who came to hear about real change in America." Through the curtain, they could hear the growing crowd. The ballroom was packed with supporters, many holding "Pierce for President" signs. People from all walks of life had come to hear the candidate who had risen from a small-town classroom teacher to become one of the most talked-about presidential candidates in recent history. Robert Johnson, a veteran political reporter from the Washington Post, sat in the front row. He opened his laptop and began typing. "Dr. Alexandria Pierce's campaign event in Memphis takes on new significance following this morning's controversial traffic court incident. Current polls show her approval rating has jumped 5 points in just the past week, putting her neck and neck with longtime frontrunners." The lights dimmed, and the crowd fell silent. A young college student named Maria Rodriguez stepped up to the podium. "3 months ago, I was just another student drowning in debt," Maria began, her voice clear and strong. "Then I heard Dr. Pierce speak about her own journey, how she worked 3 jobs to put herself through law school, how she never gave up despite the barriers placed in her way. Her story became my story." As Maria continued her introduction, Dr. Pierce checked her phone one last time. There was a message from her mother. "Baby, I saw what happened in court today. Remember what I always told you? Let your success be their karma." The crowd erupted in applause as Maria finished her introduction. "And now, please welcome the woman who will make history, Dr. Alexandria Pierce." Dr. Pierce walked onto the stage, and the applause grew even louder. Signs waved, people cheered, and several audience members wiped tears from their eyes. She stood at the podium, waiting for the crowd to settle, her presence commanding attention without demanding it. "Good evening, Memphis," she began, her voice warm and confident. "You know, something interesting happened to me this morning in traffic court." The crowd leaned forward, many already aware of the incident through social media. Instead of attacking Judge Harrington, Dr. Pierce used the morning's events to illustrate her campaign's central message. "What happened to me today happens to countless Americans every day. But this isn't about one judge or one fine. It's about a system that needs updating, about biases that need examining, and about changes that need making." In the back of the ballroom, political analysts furiously took notes. One whispered to another, "She's handling this perfectly, taking the high road while making her point. This could be the moment that defines her campaign." As Dr. Pierce continued her speech, her phone buzzed silently in her pocket. The latest national poll results had just come in. She had moved into first place among all presidential candidates. Her message of unity, reform, and hope was resonating across party lines and demographic groups. "We stand at a crossroads," she continued, her voice rising with passion. "We can choose to remain divided, pointing fingers and assigning blame, or we can choose to work together, to examine our biases, to make real changes in how our systems work." Sarah watched from backstage, fielding messages from major news networks. Good Morning America wanted Dr. Pierce for tomorrow's show. Time magazine was requesting a cover story interview. The morning's traffic court incident had unexpectedly thrust her candidate into the national spotlight in a way that no campaign advertisement could have achieved. As Dr. Pierce concluded her speech, the crowd rose in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. She had transformed a moment of discrimination into a powerful message of hope and change. Later that night, as they rode back to campaign headquarters, Sarah showed Dr. Pierce a viral meme, a split-screen image showing Judge Harrington's dismissive wave next to Dr. Pierce's campaign photo with the caption, "He saw a traffic violation. America sees its next president." Dr. Pierce smiled and looked out the car window at the Memphis skyline. Tomorrow would bring more interviews, more speeches, more opportunities to share her vision. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment to appreciate how life's small injustices sometimes open doors to greater purpose. The morning after Dr. Pierce's campaign rally, the story exploded across every major news network. In the busy newsroom of Channel 8 Memphis, producer Mike Santos stared at 6 different TV screens, each showing a different take on the courthouse incident. "Play it again," he told his video editor, leaning forward in his chair. The courthouse security footage rolled for what felt like the 100th time that morning. The camera angle captured everything perfectly. Judge Harrington's dismissive expression, his deliberate use of Ms. instead of Doctor, and the obvious shock on people's faces when he announced the excessive fine. "We got Anderson Cooper on line 1, his assistant called out. CNN wants exclusive rights to the full footage." Mike shook his head. "Too late, it's already gone viral. Have you checked social media?" On Twitter, hashtag Judge Harrington and hashtag #Pierce for President were the top trending topics. The video had been viewed over 10 million times in less than 24 hours. People were sharing their own stories of facing similar discrimination in courtrooms across the country. In Washington, D.C., veteran reporter Lisa Chen sat at her desk at the Washington Post, reviewing Judge Harrington's past cases. Her research team had spent the night digging through court records. "Look at these numbers," she told her editor, spreading papers across the desk. Over the past 5 years, Judge Harrington gave minorities fines that were, on average, 60% higher than those given to white defendants for the same offenses. Her editor leaned back in his chair. And Dr. Pierce just happened to walk into his courtroom on a day when everything was being recorded. He smiled. Sometimes the best stories write themselves. Meanwhile, at Fox News headquarters, conservative commentator David Russell prepared for his morning show. "We need to be careful how we handle this," he told his producers. "The footage speaks for itself. There's no way to spin it without looking bad." The courthouse steps had become a media circus. Reporters from every major network set up their equipment, doing live broadcasts back to back. Local residents gathered behind them, some holding signs supporting Dr. Pierce, others demanding Judge Harrington's resignation. Inside the courthouse, Jenny Martinez, the judge's clerk, could barely keep up with the phone calls. "No, the judge isn't making any statements right now," she repeated for what felt like the 1,000th time. "Yes, I'll add you to the list of interview requests." On social media, celebrities and politicians began weighing in. A famous basketball player posted, "I've got enough money to pay all the traffic fines in Tennessee, but that's not the point. The point is justice shouldn't depend on who you are or what you look like." A popular morning show host shared the courthouse video with the caption, "Watch how she maintains her dignity while he loses his. This is what presidential material looks like." By midday, political cartoonists had their say. One powerful image showed Judge Harrington at his bench, wearing a blindfold, not like Lady Justice, but one that only covered his heart. Another showed Dr. Pierce stepping up from his courtroom bench directly onto a presidential podium. Sarah Chen, Dr. Pierce's campaign manager, sat in their campaign office, watching the media frenzy unfold. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. Even late-night talk show hosts wanted to book Dr. Pierce. "We've received donations from all 50 states since this morning," an aide reported. Small donations, mostly. People are giving $3.50, $35, or $350, matching the amount of the fine. In a quiet corner of the office, Dr. Pierce's mother watched the coverage with tears in her eyes. She remembered how her daughter had faced similar treatment throughout her career, as a law student, as a young attorney, and now as a presidential candidate. But this time was different. This time, the whole world was watching. At the local coffee shop near the courthouse, baristas kept the TV turned to the news. Customers stood in groups, discussing the incident. "Did you see how calm she stayed?" one woman asked. "That's the kind of leadership we need." By evening, media analysts were calling it a pivotal moment in the presidential campaign. The story had everything: drama, injustice, dignity in the face of discrimination, and hope for change. As the sun set on this extraordinary day, the courthouse security footage played yet again on national television. But now it carried a different weight. What started as a simple traffic court session had become a national conversation about justice, bias, and the possibility of real change in America. And somewhere in the city, Judge Harrington sat alone in his study, watching his actions replay on every channel, knowing that tomorrow would bring even more scrutiny, and wondering how a routine traffic violation had turned into the biggest story in the country. Judge William Harrington sat in his leather recliner, a glass of untouched scotch on the table beside him. His wife, Martha, stood behind him, her hands resting on his shoulders as they watched the evening news together in their quiet living room. And now, our top story tonight. The news anchor began, her voice serious. Presidential candidate Dr. Alexandria Pierce made headlines today, but not for her campaign speeches. Security footage from a Tennessee courthouse has revealed a troubling interaction with local Judge William Harrington. The judge's hand trembled as he reached for his drink. The footage played again, this time in slow motion, with reporters analyzing every expression, every gesture, every word. "Martha," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I had no idea who she was." His wife squeezed his shoulders. "Bill, that's exactly the problem. Would it have made a difference if you had known?" Before he could answer, his phone rang. It was his daughter Rachel, a law student at Yale. "Dad," she said, her voice tight with emotion, "we're watching this in my constitutional law class. Professor Jenkins is using it as an example of systemic bias in the justice system." The judge muted the TV, his face growing pale. "Rachel, Dad, Dr. Pierce was a guest speaker here last semester," Rachel continued. She talked about her journey from a small town in Georgia to becoming a presidential candidate. She worked as a janitor to put herself through college. She raised her son alone after her husband died serving in Afghanistan. "And you treated her like—" Rachel's voice trailed off, but the silence said everything. The doorbell rang, making both Judge Harrington and Martha jump. Through the window, they could see reporters gathering on their front lawn, cameras flashing in the growing darkness. Martha peeked through the curtains. There must be at least 20 news vans out there. The judge's phone buzzed again, this time with a text from his old law school roommate, now a senior partner at a prestigious firm in Chicago. "Just watch the footage. Remember all those conversations we had about blind justice? Time to look in the mirror, Bill." On the TV, now muted, they showed split-screen footage. On one side, the courthouse video. On the other, Dr. Pierce's impressive resume scrolling like credits. Harvard Law Review editor, Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient, internationally recognized civil rights attorney, and now a leading presidential candidate. Judge Harrington stood up suddenly, walking to his home office. The walls were covered with awards and certificates. Justice of the Year, Outstanding Service to the Community, Excellence in Judicial Practice. They all seemed to mock him now. He sat at his computer and began searching through his past cases. With each click, with each file he opened, a pattern emerged that he had never noticed, or perhaps had never wanted to notice. The numbers didn't lie. Higher fines for minorities, stricter sentences, fewer warnings. Martha appeared in the doorway. The Chief Justice called again. "He wants to see you first thing tomorrow morning." The judge nodded absently, still scrolling through case files. He opened a folder from 3 months ago. A white businessman had been caught going 15 miles per hour over the speed limit. The fine: $75. Last month, a Hispanic student, 10 miles per hour over, $200. 2 weeks ago, an African-American teacher, 7 miles per hour over, $150. "Oh God," he whispered, putting his head in his hands. His phone buzzed one more time. It was a message from Jenny, his clerk. "Judge, I think you should see this." Attached was a link to a video. He clicked it with shaking hands. It was Dr. Pierce at a press conference just minutes ago. A reporter was asking about the traffic court incident. "I don't want Judge Harrington to lose his job," Dr. Pierce was saying, her voice firm but compassionate. "What I want is for this to be a moment of reflection, not just for one judge, but for our entire justice system. Sometimes it takes seeing ourselves through someone else's eyes to recognize our own biases." The judge turned off his computer screen, but Dr. Pierce's words echoed in his mind. Through the window, he could see more news vans arriving, their lights illuminating his front yard like a stadium. "What do I do now?" he asked Martha, his voice small. She sat down beside him, taking his hand. You do what you've always taught Rachel to do when she makes a mistake. You acknowledge it, learn from it, and work to make it right. Outside, the reporters waited in the darkness, hoping for a statement, a reaction, anything. But inside his home office, Judge William Harrington was already facing his toughest critic, himself. 3 days after the courthouse incident, Dr. Alexandria Pierce stood on the stage of the National Convention Center in Atlanta. The hall was filled beyond capacity, with people standing in the aisles and sitting on the floor. Every major news network had their cameras trained on her. "What happened to me in that courtroom," Dr. Pierce began, her voice steady and clear, "is not just my story. It's the story of millions of Americans who face similar treatment every day, in courtrooms, in stores, in job interviews, in everyday life." In the audience, a young black law student named Marcus Johnson wiped tears from his eyes. Just last week, he had been pulled over and given a ticket for going 3 miles per hour over the speed limit. The fine had taken half of his monthly food budget. Sarah Chen, Dr. Pierce's campaign manager, watched from backstage as social media exploded with responses. People were sharing their own stories using hashtag #MyTrafficCourtStory. The hashtag had reached over 5 million posts in just a few hours. Yesterday, Dr. Pierce continued. "A young woman sent me her story about being fined $500 for a broken taillight, while her white friend received only a warning for the same violation. Today, I received a letter from a Latino father who had to work 2 extra shifts to pay an excessive speeding ticket that others would have gotten a warning for." The crowd listened in complete silence, many nodding in recognition of their own experiences. "But this isn't about anger." Dr. Pierce's voice grew stronger. "This isn't about revenge. This is about change, real change. The kind of change that starts with looking in the mirror and asking ourselves difficult questions." In a small diner in Tennessee, a group of judges watched the speech on the mounted TV. One of them, Judge Mary Thompson, turned to her colleagues. "She's right, you know. How many times have we made snap judgments based on appearance?" Back at the convention center, Dr. Pierce held up a check. "This morning, I received this from an anonymous donor. It's for $350,000, 1,000 times the fine I received." The note attached said, "Use this to fight for those who can't afford justice." The audience erupted in applause. Camera flashes lit up the room like lightning. Today, Dr. Pierce announced, "I'm establishing the Equal Justice Initiative Fund. This money will help people who can't afford to pay unfair fines and will provide legal support to those fighting discrimination in our justice system." In his home office, Judge Harrington watched the speech on his laptop. His daughter Rachel sat beside him, holding his hand. On his desk lay his letter of temporary leave from the bench, not a resignation, but a commitment to spend time learning and changing. Dr. Pierce's voice continued from the screen. To Judge Harrington, "If you're watching this, thank you. Thank you for showing America what we need to change. And thank you for reminding us that sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest opportunities for growth." In a coffee shop in Chicago, 2 women watched the speech on their phones. "That's why I'm voting for her," one said to the other. "She could have destroyed him, but instead, she's using this to heal and teach." The speech was reaching its conclusion. Dr. Pierce stepped away from the podium and walked to the center of the stage. "We stand at a crossroads in our nation's history. We can choose to let incidents like this divide us further, or we can use them as stepping stones toward understanding and change." In a high school classroom in Los Angeles, a teacher paused the live stream of the speech. "This," she told her students, "is what leadership looks like." As Dr. Pierce finished speaking, the entire convention center rose in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 10 minutes. People hugged each other, some cried, others pulled out their phones to donate to the new fund. Sarah Chen checked the latest polling numbers on her tablet. Dr. Pierce's approval ratings had skyrocketed across all demographic groups. Even people who disagreed with her politics admired her handling of the situation. Later that evening, as Dr. Pierce left the convention center, she saw a group of young girls waiting by her car. One of them, no more than 12, held up a sign that read, "Thank you for showing us how to fight with grace." Dr. Pierce stopped to hug each of them. As she did, news photographers captured the moment, a moment that would appear on front pages across the country the next day. symbolizing how one small incident in a Tennessee traffic court had transformed into a national movement for change. Judge William Harrington stood nervously in front of the community center in downtown Memphis. It had been 6 weeks since the traffic court incident that changed his life. Today would be his first public appearance since beginning his journey of self-reflection and change. Inside, the room was packed with local residents, civil rights leaders, and members of the press. Among them sat his daughter Rachel, who had flown in from Yale Law School to support him. His wife Martha squeezed his hand before he walked to the podium. "Good morning," he began, his voice shakier than his usual courtroom tone. "For 30 years, I've stood behind the judge's bench, looking down at people. Today, I stand before you as just a man who finally learned to look within himself." The room fell silent. Even the reporters stopped typing on their phones to listen. When Dr. Pierce walked into my courtroom that day, I didn't see a Harvard graduate, a civil rights leader, or a presidential candidate, he continued. I didn't even see a person. I saw what my unconscious biases wanted me to see. And that's the problem. In the back of the room, Jenny Martinez, his clerk, wiped away tears. She remembered how different the judge had been these past weeks, attending diversity training sessions, meeting with community leaders, and spending hours reviewing his past cases with a new perspective. For the past 6 weeks, Judge Harrington explained, "I've been doing something I should have done years ago. I've been listening, really listening." He gestured to the people around him. "I've sat in living rooms with families who were affected by my unfair rulings. I've heard their stories. I've seen the impact of my biases." He pulled out a thick stack of papers from his briefcase. "These are letters from people I'd judged unfairly over the years. Some couldn't afford the excessive fines I imposed. Some lost jobs because of it. Some had to choose between paying my fines and buying groceries." The judge's voice cracked. "I always prided myself on being fair and just, but I wasn't. I was just hiding behind my robe and my privilege." Rachel watched her father with pride. This was not the same man who had stubbornly defended his actions 6 weeks ago. This was someone new, someone humbled and transformed. "Today," he announced, "I'm launching the Judicial Fairness Review Program. With support from the state Supreme Court, we'll be reviewing cases from the past 5 years where bias may have influenced sentencing. We're establishing a fund to repay excessive fines, and we're implementing new training programs for all court officials." In the audience, community leader Reverend James Brown nodded approvingly. He had spent countless hours with Judge Harrington over the past weeks, sharing stories of how systemic bias affected his congregation. "But that's not all," the judge continued. "Starting next month, I'll be teaching a new course at the State Judicial College called Recognizing and Addressing Unconscious Bias in the Courtroom. Because what happened in my courtroom that day happens everywhere, every day, and it needs to stop." Martha Harrington watched as her husband spoke with a passion she hadn't seen in years. The man who had once hidden behind legal precedents and procedure was now leading a charge for change. "Dr. Pierce could have ended my career," he acknowledged. "Instead, she gave me the greatest gift possible, the chance to see myself clearly and the opportunity to change." As he concluded his speech, Judge Harrington did something unprecedented. He stepped down from the podium and walked into the audience. He sat down among the people, symbolically removing the barrier between himself and those he served. The questions that followed were tough but fair. People shared their experiences, their pain, and their hope for real change. The judge listened to each one, taking notes, nodding in understanding. Later that evening, as the Harringtons drove home, Rachel showed her father a text message from one of her law professors. "Watched your dad's speech. Using it in my ethics class tomorrow. This is how real change happens." Judge Harrington smiled, feeling both humbled and hopeful. Tomorrow, he would return to his chambers, not to sit on the bench yet, but to continue his work on the review program. The walls that had once displayed only his achievements now held photographs of community meetings, reminder notes about checking his biases, and at the center, a framed quote from Dr. Pierce. "Justice is not just about following laws. It's about seeing each other's humanity." The transformation of Judge William Harrington had become more than just a personal journey. It was becoming a model for change in the justice system itself. 1 year had passed since that fateful morning in traffic court. The autumn sun streamed through the tall windows of the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., where a historic moment was about to unfold. Dr. Alexandria Pierce, now the clear front-runner in the presidential race, stood at the podium. Her poll numbers showed her leading by 15 points, with support coming from across all political and demographic lines. But today wasn't about campaign speeches or political promises. To everyone's surprise, Judge William Harrington walked onto the stage. The crowd fell silent. No one had expected to see these two together, yet here they were, standing side by side. 1 year ago, Dr. Pierce began, "A traffic ticket changed America." She smiled warmly at Judge Harrington. But this isn't just a story about a fine or about one judge's transformation. This is a story about how change happens, one person, one moment, one choice at a time. The audience included faces familiar from that memorable day: Jenny Martinez, the judge's clerk; Sarah Chen, Dr. Pierce's campaign manager; and even Officer Thompson, the bailiff who had witnessed it all. They watched as history unfolded before them. Judge Harrington stepped forward to the microphone. "1 year ago, I was a different man," he said, his voice steady and humble. "Today, I stand before you to announce that the Judicial Fairness Review Program has reviewed over 10,000 cases from courts across Tennessee. We've refunded more than $2 million in excessive fines, and most importantly, we've helped change how justice is served in our state." Dr. Pierce held up a thick report. The changes Judge Harrington initiated have become a model for court systems across the country. 15 states have now adopted similar review programs. The Equal Justice Initiative Fund has helped over 50,000 Americans fight unfair treatment in courts. From her seat in the front row, Rachel Harrington beamed with pride. She had just graduated from Yale Law School and was preparing to clerk for the Supreme Court, inspired by both her father's transformation and Dr. Pierce's leadership. Today, Dr. Pierce continued, "I'm honored to announce that Judge Harrington will lead the new National Commission on Judicial Equality when I take office as president." His journey from that traffic court to today proves that real change is possible. The judge reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. With cameras flashing, he removed a worn photograph. It was the security camera still from that day in court, showing him dismissively waving Dr. Pierce away. "I keep this as a reminder," he said, "not of shame, but of growth." In the audience, Martha Harrington wiped away tears as she watched her husband. The past year had changed him in ways she never expected. Their dinner conversations were different now, filled with discussions about justice, equality, and the power of second chances. Dr. Pierce's son, James, a military veteran like his late father, sat next to Martha. The two families had become close over the year, turning a moment of conflict into a bond of understanding. "My mother used to tell me," Dr. Pierce shared, "that sometimes the biggest doors of change open through the smallest moments of injustice." That traffic court video has been viewed over 100 million times. It's being used in law schools, police academies, and judicial training programs across the world. Judge Harrington nodded. "And every time it plays, it reminds us that justice isn't about power, it's about humanity." As the ceremony concluded, something unexpected happened. A group of traffic court judges from across the country stood up, each holding a sign that read, "Change starts with me." It was a movement that had grown far beyond one courtroom in Tennessee. Later that evening, at a small private dinner, Dr. Pierce and Judge Harrington sat with their families, away from the cameras and reporters. They weren't a presidential candidate and a judge anymore, just two people who had learned that the greatest changes often come from the most unexpected moments. Rachel raised her glass in a toast. "To traffic tickets that changed the world." Everyone laughed, but they all understood the deeper truth. What had started as a moment of injustice had transformed into a movement of change, healing, and hope. The legacy of that morning in traffic court would continue long after the headlines faded, living on in changed laws, reformed systems, and most importantly, in changed hearts and minds. As the sun set on Washington, D.C., Dr. Pierce and Judge Harrington stood on the balcony of the press club, looking out at the city they would soon help transform together. Sometimes, they both realized, justice comes not from winning or losing, but from having the courage to change.